Hello everybody and welcome back to No Frills, Just Facts, the series where I try to explain guitar-based concepts in under 5 minutes. I'm joined today by my cat Otis, who's in my lap. Let's go ahead and get into it. Today we're talking about EQ, and EQ specifically and how it pertains to guitarists and pedalboard EQ. Most of the time when guitarists think about EQ, they tend to think about one of two things. Usually it's a pedal like the Boss GE7 or the MXR 10-band EQ, or it's just simply the EQ that's on your amp's control panel that's usually something like a low, mid, and a high frequency range. If you're someone who's unfamiliar with how EQ works, what I want you to do is I want you to go to your car, and then I want you to plug in a song, maybe a song that only has guitar in it, which could be pretty helpful to really illustrate how it can apply to you as a guitarist. And I want you to go into the settings on your radio, and I want you to find where you can adjust the bass, the mid, and the treble, and I want you to turn up the bass and see what that does to the sound, then turn up the mids, and then turn up the treble and see what that does to your sound. That is the most basic form of EQ that we can really think of. But the question is, why does it do that? Well, we have a range of frequencies or pitches that we can hear in our human ear that ranges from around 20 hertz, which is super low frequencies, all the way up to about 20,000 hertz. Each person's hearing is a little different. Some people can hear more than others, some people can hear less than others. It really varies person by person. Here's a quick illustration of what those frequencies tend to look like when we think about them in a musical context, as well as a sine wave that will pass through all of the various frequencies so you can hear kind of what it all sounds like. Using EQ enables us to be able to control and either increase or sometimes decrease certain ranges of those frequencies. Like in the car, when we turn up the lows, we're turning up the lower side of those frequencies. When we turn up the mids, we're turning up the middle portion of those frequencies. And when we turn up the treble, we're turning up the high portion of those frequencies. Now, a sine wave is a computer-generated sound that does not exist in nature. In nature, whenever we pluck a note like the low E on our guitar, we have the fundamental note, which is that E, and then you actually have harmonic overtones, we call them, which are kind of like resonant frequencies that build through the range. And that's why when you pluck even just one note and then adjust the EQ on it, you can actually hear the EQ take effect, is because it's not just the one note, you're hearing all of those overtones. Now, there are three main types of EQ that we look at, which is like a basic EQ, which is what we see on our amp panel or in our car. Then we have a graphic EQ, which is what we see in terms of our pedals and a lot of times in mixers and in live sound operations. And then we have a parametric EQ. However, in order to understand basic and graphic, I think it's actually better to start with parametric EQ, because in a parametric EQ, we can actually see and control everything about what we want to adjust in terms of our EQ. For example, if you wanted to pick out 2000 hertz on your parametric EQ, you can grab that one frequency and then narrow what's called the Q, which is essentially the bell curve that attaches to the center note, which is that 2000 hertz, and you can narrow it so you're really only boosting just 2000 hertz or lowering 2000 hertz, or you can widen the Q so that that bell curve is very wide and you're adjusting all the frequencies in that kind of range, with the center peak of that curve being the 2000 hertz. Generally speaking, we really only use parametric EQs when we're really looking at mixing guitars in like a recording situation, because outboard gear based parametric EQ can be fairly pricey. However, pedal lines like Helix and Kemper and those modeling profilers often have a parametric EQ that you can mess around with within their own settings, so that's somewhere that you could start if you wanted to mess around with what a parametric EQ does. It's often a lot right at the beginning to try and figure out a parametric EQ. However, when we visualize EQ as a parametric EQ, it becomes a little bit easier to understand how the rest of the EQs work. So now let's go back to our basic EQ. Again, this is something like what we have in our car stereo or what we have on our amp panels. And what that is it essentially acts as though we have kind of a bell curve in the lows, a bell curve in the mids, and a bell curve in the highs. And you can turn up or turn down those bell curves. and you can kind of tweak your tone a little bit with that. The next one, and the one that we probably think of most often, would be that graphic EQ like a pedal. Again, we bring up the Boss GE7 or the MXR 10-band EQ, and there's a ton of other ones. These are probably just the ones that I feel like are the most popular and that people know on site. Each one of those little knobs is attached to a specific frequency that is fairly popular to adjust on a guitar. In addition, that it has a little bit of a bell curve to it, but it's a lot narrower of a bell curve or a Q than would be found on our most basic bass, middle, and treble EQ. What's nice about these pedals is that you can actually see visually how your tone is colored. For example, if you raise the lows and you raise the highs and then you drop the mids, you'll see that scoop in your EQ and you'll be able to visually recognize what sound you're going for. If you reverse that and boost the mids and drop the lows and highs, you'll see that mid boost represented in your pedal. As far as placement of an EQ pedal on a pedal board, typically people will either put them before distortion or after distortion. Reason being that when you turn on that EQ pedal, you are coloring everything going into that pedal. So if you put it before your overdrive line, you are just controlling your guitar's signal and adjusting the frequencies or the EQ on that. If you put it after your overdrive line, you can actually control your overdrives a little bit more. This is all personal preference, and if you have an EQ pedal, try it all over the place. The last thing we have to talk about is, why does EQ even matter? Why do we want an EQ pedal? Well, EQ has to do with two things. Number one is identity, right? Your identity is tied to how your tone is colored, and EQ has a lot to do with that. It's the reason that we can think of amps as American and British. American amps are typically high bass, high treble, and a scoop in the middle. They refer to it as a scooped frequency range. That's our typical Fender sound. Then over across the pond, we have that mid-range boost for British style amps. If you color your EQ, you are coloring your tone. It's the reason why when we hear the jangly sound of that Vox amplifier, we automatically think of the Beatles. It's because they used Vox amps, and whenever we heard their guitars, it had that distinctive mid-range push that you get from a British amp, plus the high jingly trebles that you get from a Vox amp. And we now associate that sound with the Beatles. The second reason why EQ is important is because it has to do with how well you are heard in your band. Last year I went to a show and I saw someone playing with a Marshall head and a 410 cab, and you couldn't hear him at all. And it's because his EQ was dimed. And so it was just noise. It was just mud. There was nothing really coming out. And it was crazy because he was doing really cool shredding stuff, but he was just lost in the sauce. So this is the way we want to think about our band settings, right? If you play in a band, you want to kind of split up the frequency range as best you can. Let the bass cover the low end. You don't need too much low end in your signal. If you have a singer who sings really high, let him or her cover the high end. If you have two guitars, try to shape your tone so that you're kind of complementing each other. It's the reason why when you have rhythm guitarists and lead guitarists in one band, the lead guitarist is usually playing around an octave up from where the rhythm guitarist is so that they're not just muddying each other up. Drums also exist in the low to low mids range, and then their cymbals exist in that high range. So really it leaves that middle frequency range open for guitarists, which is where we shine. An example of this is Led Zeppelin. John Paul Jones and John Bonham covering the lows and low mids with the drums and the bass and sometimes keyboards. And Robert Plant, high screeches, killing it up there, covering that higher register, leaving that perfect little pocket for Jimmy Page to be in so that we hear every little nuance of what they do. This is why EQ is important. How do you guys find that EQ works best for you? Are you more of a scooped player or are you more of a mid-boost player? Are there any other guitar-based concepts that you'd like me to try and probably fail to explain in under 5 minutes? Let me know in the comments down below. If you like what you're seeing, please like and subscribe. I check my analytics and 99% of my viewers are not subscribed, so hey, think about subscribing. If not, no worries. Thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Mac Wright. Go make someone else's day better, and we will see you around.